I found it at a thrift store, buried under a pile of old coats and forgotten clothes. It wasn't something I was looking for, just one of those items you stumble upon and can't seem to put down. It was a jumpsuit, dark blue with a patch on the chest that said Jack in faded white letters. It looked like something a mechanic would wear, a little worn around the edges, but in surprisingly good condition for something that had probably seen years of hard work. I wasn't sure why I picked it up. Maybe it was the way it stood out among the mismatched jackets and jeans, or maybe it was just the fact that I liked finding things with a bit of history. I took it to the register, paid a few bucks, and took it home. It seemed like a cool piece to wear around the house, especially when doing odd jobs or cleaning. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I should have. The first time I put it on, it felt strange. The jumpsuit was a little big for me, loose around the arms and legs, but it was comfortable enough. I figured it had just been stretched out over the years. There was a faint, musty smell to it, like it had been stored away for a long time, but that wasn't unusual for thrift store clothes. I wore it while fixing up a leaky faucet in my kitchen, and it felt oddly appropriate, like it was meant for that kind of work. But as I was finishing up, I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror, and something didn't look right. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a moment, just a split second, where it seemed like the jumpsuit didn't fit me at all. It was like I was looking at someone else, someone taller, broader, standing where I was supposed to be. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my own reflection staring back at me, looking a little tired and confused. I laughed it off, chalking it up to a trick of the light, and went about my day. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I found myself wearing the jumpsuit more and more. It was comfortable, and it seemed to fit better each time I put it on, almost as if it was molding to my shape. I wore it when I was doing chores, running errands, even just lounging around the house. But the more I wore it, the stranger things became. I started noticing things out of the corner of my eye, movements, shadows, like someone else was in the room with me. I'd be cooking dinner, and I'd see a flicker of motion in the reflection of the kitchen window, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Or I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in the hallway, just for a moment, before it disappeared. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired or stressed, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The jumpsuit wasn't just comfortable anymore. It was comforting, like a warm, familiar embrace that I didn't want to take off. I even slept in it a few times, which was something I'd never done with any clothes before. And every time I put it on, that name on the patch, Jack, seemed to stand out a little more, the letters clearer, sharper, like they were being restored, like they wanted to be seen. One night, I had a dream. At least, I think it was a dream. I was standing in a garage, tools scattered around me, the smell of oil and metal heavy in the air. It was dark, but I could see a car parked in the corner, the hood up, like it was waiting to be fixed. I could feel the weight of the jumpsuit on my shoulders, and when I looked down, I saw grease stains on my hands, my fingers rough and calloused. There was a man standing next to the car, his back turned to me. He was wearing the same jumpsuit, the same patch with the name Jack. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at the car. I wanted to speak, to ask him who he was, but the words wouldn't come. I could only watch as he slowly turned around, and when I saw his face, my blood ran cold. It was my face. But it wasn't. His skin was pale, almost gray, his eyes dark and hollow, and there was a cold, twisted smile on his lips. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, "It fits, doesn't it?" I woke up drenched in sweat, the jumpsuit clinging to my skin, and for a moment, I thought I was still in the garage. I could still smell the oil, still feel the weight of those eyes on me, and I had to force myself to get up, to peel off the jumpsuit and throw it across the room. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I decided I was done with it. I shoved the jumpsuit into a bag and drove to the thrift store, planning to return it or donate it, or just get rid of it. But when I got there, the store was closed. There was a sign on the door saying it had been shut down, with no explanation. I checked my watch. There was no way it should have been closed at that hour. I stood there for a moment, staring at the sign, trying to make sense of it, and then I felt something strange. The bag was moving. I looked down, and I could see the fabric of the jumpsuit shifting, writhing, like something was inside it, trying to get out. I dropped the bag, and it fell open, spilling the jumpsuit onto the ground. For a moment, it just lay there, crumpled and still, and I thought I'd imagined it. Then it started to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like it was breathing. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and watched as the jumpsuit seemed to lift itself up, the sleeves rising, the legs straightening, until it was standing upright, like there was someone inside it, filling it out. But there was no one there. Just empty air, holding the shape of a person, with the patch on the chest still proudly displaying the name Jack. I wanted to run, to get in my car and drive as far away as I could, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as the jumpsuit took a step toward me, then another. And as it moved, I heard that same voice from my dream, soft and echoing, like it was whispering right into my ear. It fits, doesn't it? I don't remember how I got home. The next thing I knew, I was sitting on my couch, the jumpsuit lying in my lap, like it had been waiting for me. I thought about burning it, tearing it to shreds, anything to get rid of it, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt like it belonged to me now, like I was meant to have it. The dreams got worse after that. Every night, I was back in that garage, standing next to that man with my face fixing cars, tightening bolts, wiping grease from my hands. But the garage wasn't empty anymore. There were more figures, all wearing jumpsuits, all with different names on their patches. They never spoke, never moved, just stood there, watching, waiting. And every morning, I'd wake up to find the jumpsuit lying neatly folded on my bed, even if I was sure I'd left it somewhere else. It's been weeks now, and I don't know what's real anymore. I've started wearing the jumpsuit all the time. It feels right, like it was made for me, like it fits better than anything else I've ever owned. I don't know who Jack was or where he is now, but I think I'm starting to understand. The jumpsuit isn't just a piece of clothing. It's a uniform, a role, and once you put it on, it changes you. I don't know if Jack was the first, or if there were others before him, but I can feel him inside the fabric, inside my head, whispering to me, guiding my hands, telling me what to do. I don't want to wear it anymore, but I can't take it off. It's like it's become part of me, and when I try to pull it off, it clings to my skin, tightening, squeezing, like it doesn't want to let go. I don't know how much longer I can fight it. Every day, I feel a little less like myself, a little more like Jack. And I'm starting to see things, even when I'm awake, faces in the mirror, faces that aren't mine, smiling, watching, waiting. I don't know what will happen when I'm gone, when Jack finally takes over, but I have a feeling it won't end with me. Maybe someone else will find the jumpsuit, buried under a pile of old clothes at a thrift store, and they'll pick it up, thinking it's just a cool piece to wear around the house. And maybe they'll put it on and they'll see the name on the patch and they'll wonder who Jack was. But by then, it won't matter, because the jumpsuit will fit and they'll be the next one to wear it, to become part of the uniform, part of the job. And the job never ends.
I always thought train stations had a certain eerie charm to them. There's something about the empty platforms at night, the distant hum of a train you can't see, and the flickering of fluorescent lights that makes your skin crawl. But nothing could have prepared me for the horror of the midnight train. It started about a month ago. I was traveling for work, a late-night trip that took me to a small rundown station on the outskirts of town. It was one of those stations that you'd only find if you were really looking for it, hidden away behind a tangle of streets, almost forgotten by time. My train wasn't due until midnight, so I had some time to kill, and I decided to grab a coffee and wait on the platform. The station was practically deserted, just a few benches, a dusty vending machine, and a ticket booth that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, and I could hear every second passing, echoing through the silence. I checked my phone, but I had no signal and the Wi-Fi was out, so I just sat there, sipping my lukewarm coffee and waiting for the train to arrive. It was around 11:45 when I first heard it, a low, distant rumble like thunder, but steady and rhythmic, getting louder with every passing second. I glanced up, expecting to see the train's headlights in the distance, but the tracks were empty. The sound grew louder and I could feel it vibrating through the bench, through the concrete platform beneath my feet. It was as if the train was barreling down the tracks, but there was nothing there. I stood up, peering down the tracks, straining to see through the darkness. That's when I noticed something strange. The clock on the wall had stopped, frozen at 11:45, even though I could still hear the ticking. I glanced at my watch and it was the same, 11:45, unmoving, the second hand twitching, trying to move forward but stuck. A cold chill ran down my spine and I turned to see if there was anyone else around, but the platform was still empty. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of light, faint and flickering like a candle flame in the distance. It was coming from the end of the platform, where the tracks disappeared into the darkness. I walked toward the light, my footsteps echoing through the silence. The closer I got, the brighter it became, until I could make out the shape of an old-fashioned train, its metal gleaming in the dim glow. It looked like something out of a different era, with sleek, black carriages and polished brass fittings. There was no sound of an engine, no smoke, just the low, steady rumble that seemed to come from the very air around it. As I stood there, staring at the train, the doors slid open with a soft hiss, and I felt a strange pull, like something was urging me to step inside. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to leave, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me up the steps and into the carriage. The doors closed behind me and the train began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. I looked around, expecting to see other passengers, but the carriage was empty. The seats were old and worn, the leather cracked and peeling, and there was a faint, musty smell in the air like damp wood and mildew. I took a seat by the window, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. Outside, the world was a blur of darkness, with occasional flashes of light that flickered past the window. I couldn't tell if we were in a tunnel, or if the train was just moving too fast for me to see anything clearly. I glanced around the carriage again, and that's when I noticed the mirrors. There were small, oval-shaped mirrors mounted above each seat, tilted at an angle so you could see your own reflection. But when I looked into the mirror above my seat, I didn't see my reflection. I saw someone else. He was a man, probably in his late 30s, with short, dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He was dressed in a suit, and there was a briefcase on the seat beside him. He looked calm, almost bored, like he was just another commuter on his way home. But then his eyes met mine and I realized he could see me too. He didn't smile, didn't react, just stared at me, unblinking, as if he was trying to memorize my face. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, and I looked away, down at my hands, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But when I looked up again, he was still there, staring at me, his expression unchanged. I tried to move, to get up and leave the carriage, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in my seat, forced to watch this man who shouldn't have been there. The train rumbled on, the sound growing louder, almost deafening, and the lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the carriage. The man in the mirror finally moved. Slowly, almost deliberately, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver pocket watch. He held it up, letting it dangle from its chain, and I could see the second hand ticking, perfectly synchronized with the ticking I'd heard at the station. He glanced down at the watch, then back up at me, and for the first time he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, almost mocking, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He mouthed something, but I couldn't make out the words. The lights flickered again, and for a moment I thought I saw him standing right in front of me on my side of the mirror, but then the light steadied and he was back in the reflection, still smiling, still holding the watch. I tried to scream to call for help, but no sound came out. The train kept moving faster and faster, and I could feel the carriage shaking, the mirrors rattling on the walls. The man's smile widened, and he mouthed the words again, more slowly this time so I could read his lips. "Time's up." The lights went out, plunging the carriage into complete darkness. I could still hear the rumble of the train louder than ever, but everything else was silent. I don't know how long I sat there, in the dark, unable to move, unable to see. It felt like hours, but it could have been seconds or even days. When the lights finally came back on, the train had stopped. The doors slid open and I could see the platform outside, bathed in a dim yellow light. I didn't wait to see if the man was still in the mirror. I stumbled out of my seat, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran for the door. I didn't care where I was as long as I was off that train. I found myself standing on a platform that looked almost identical to the one I'd been at before, but there were subtle differences. The clock was gone, replaced by an old rusted sign that read "Midnight Special" in faded, peeling letters. There was no one around, no ticket booth, no vending machines, just a single bench and a staircase leading up to the street. I took the stairs 2 at a time, desperate to get away, but when I reached the top, I stopped dead in my tracks. I was standing in the middle of a small, empty street, lined with dark, silent buildings. There were no cars, no people, no signs of life at all, just rows of old, crumbling storefronts that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I walked down the street, hoping to find a main road or a taxi, but it was like I'd stepped into another world, a place that had been forgotten, left to rot in the dark. The street twisted and turned, looping back on itself, and no matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the train station. I don't know how long I wandered those streets, but eventually I found a payphone tucked away in an alley. I picked up the receiver, hoping to call someone, anyone, but there was no dial tone. I pressed the buttons anyway, and to my surprise the line clicked and I heard a voice. "Next train leaves at midnight?" It was the same voice I'd heard in my head, when the man in the mirror mouthed those words. I slammed the receiver down and backed away, but the payphone started to ring loud and shrill, echoing through the empty street. I ran, my footsteps pounding against the pavement, but the ringing followed me, growing louder, faster, until it was all I could hear. I made it back to the station, panting, out of breath, and there it was, the train waiting on the tracks, its lights flickering, the doors open. I could feel that pull again, stronger this time, dragging me toward the train, and I knew deep down that I couldn't resist it. I don't remember getting on the train. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the same seat, the same mirrors above me, and the train was moving faster than before. I glanced up, and there he was, the man in the mirror, still smiling, still holding the pocket watch. I realized then that the train wasn't taking me anywhere. It was just going in circles, looping through the same dark, twisted tracks, forever. And I was stuck, trapped in this endless, nightmarish ride with no way to get off. The man in the mirror raised his watch again, and I saw the second hand ticking faster and faster, spinning out of control. He mouthed the words one last time, and I knew with a sickening certainty that he wasn't talking about the time on his watch. "Time's up." I never thought I'd feel fear every time my smartphone vibrated. I know it sounds ridiculous, but after what happened, I get chills every time I see that faint glow from my pocket or feel that soft buzz in my hand. It started just over a month ago when I downloaded a random app, something I'd now give anything to undo. It was a late night, and like so many others, I was lying in bed scrolling aimlessly through my phone, half asleep and bored. A notification popped up, one of those strange ads you sometimes see for games or personality tests. But this one had no logo or app name, just a plain text bubble that read, "Download your life tracker now. See who's thinking about you." I was skeptical, but curiosity got the better of me. I clicked the notification, which took me straight to the App Store where the app, Tracker, waited for me. It had no reviews, no ratings, just a single button, install. For reasons I can't quite explain, I went for it. The app opened with a black screen that slowly faded into white text. "Welcome to your life tracker. You are watched." I chuckled, finding it weirdly funny, then realized I had no idea what the app actually did. I checked my notifications tab, and a single notification blinked from the app. Beginning tracking. I tapped the notification but it didn't open anything. The screen just went black and the app seemed to disappear from my phone. Thinking it was just a weird glitch, I ignored it and went to sleep. But the next morning things were different. I woke up to the usual stream of notifications, texts, emails, and the occasional Instagram alert. But one notification stood out, a notification from Tracker, the app one thought had vanished. It simply read, "She's thinking about you." Confused, I opened the notification expecting some kind of social feature or chat room, but it led nowhere. It simply opened my main home screen. I went to the app list on my phone but Tracker wasn't listed there. I shrugged it off and got ready for the day thinking it was just another strange tech glitch. Then the notifications got more personal. A few days later, while I was out with friends, I got another one. "Someone close to you is keeping a secret." Again, I tried opening the notification but it just sent me back to my main screen. It was starting to feel intrusive. That night, as I was lying in bed, I got another. "Tonight, the truth will come out." Chills ran down my spine. Just as I was about to brush it off, my phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from my friend Mike. He texted, "We need to talk. I've been keeping something from you." I couldn't believe it. I thought the app was just some creepy randomizer, but Mike's message lined up exactly with Tracker's notification. I tried calling him but he didn't answer. The app vibrated again. "They're not telling you everything." I didn't sleep that night and Mike never answered. He texted me the next day saying, "Sorry for the weird message, bro. I don't know what came over me. I let it go but Tracker didn't. It seemed to know everything." The notifications got more personal, like "You're being watched" when I was alone at home or "Someone is lying to you" whenever I'd meet with someone. Each time I'd try opening the notification but it would just disappear. I started feeling paranoid, jumping every time my phone buzzed, and it only got worse. Then one night as I lay in bed, I got a new notification from Tracker. "Check your photos." Against my better judgment, I opened my photo gallery. To my shock, there were photos in there I had never taken. Photos of me sleeping. Photos of me in my living room, of my front door, taken from just outside. My blood ran cold as I swiped through the images, each one seeming closer and closer to my room, until the last picture showed my bedroom door, taken from right outside. My heart pounded in my chest. I locked my doors and windows, turned off all the lights and sat in the middle of my room clutching my phone. My mind was racing, trying to figure out who could be doing this and how. I was about to call the police when my phone buzzed with another Tracker notification. Calling them won't help. I dropped my phone, my hands shaking. How did it know what I was thinking? It was just an app, a program, not a person. I wanted to delete it, but I couldn't find it anywhere on my phone. From that night on, my life was a nightmare. Every time I tried to ignore the notifications, they grew more persistent. I'd get messages saying, "You're not alone," whenever I'd go to bed, or "They're here" when I'd step into my house. It wasn't long before I was too scared to leave my house. I quit my job, cut off contact with my friends, and stopped going outside. I was afraid to even open the curtains, paranoid that someone might be watching. The notifications became my only company, taunting me with messages like, "They're closer than you think." My phone became an object of dread, a source of constant anxiety. I'd consider throwing it away, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I needed to know, needed to understand what was happening to me. The next night, the notification came through as usual, but this one was different. "Check your messages." I opened my messages and there was a new thread. It was blank, no name, just a message that read, "Do you know who you are?" I replied asking, "Who is this?" The answer came instantly, "I am you." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. It was absurd, impossible, but a sick part of me was starting to believe it. I started responding, typing out desperate questions like, "What do you want? And why are you doing this?" The response was always the same, "To help you see the truth." Days passed in a haze. I barely ate, barely slept, my mind consumed by the endless notifications. Then one day it happened. "This is your last warning." The message flashed on my screen, and with a trembling hand I typed, Last warning for what? But no answer came. My phone buzzed and the screen went dark. I tried turning it back on, but nothing happened. I plugged it in, hoping the battery had just died, but the screen stayed black. I felt a strange mix of relief and panic. Maybe it was over, maybe I was finally free. I barely noticed the time passing until I realized it was night, the house deathly quiet. I went to bed, feeling a sense of peace for the first time in weeks. I closed my eyes, drifting into a deep, dreamless sleep. But then I woke up. My phone lay on the bedside table, the screen dimly glowing, even though it had been off all day. I picked it up and the screen lit up with a single message. Look out your window. I didn't want to look. I knew deep down that something terrible awaited me outside. But against my will, I walked to the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I drew back the curtain, peering into the darkness. There, in the dim light, I saw the outline of a figure standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. They stood motionless, staring straight up at me, their features obscured in shadow. My phone buzzed again. Welcome home. The figure took a step forward and I felt every muscle in my body freeze in place. My phone buzzed again, each notification a relentless drumbeat of fear. You belong to us. We're waiting for you. Open the door. I dropped my phone, backing away from the window, my mind racing. I didn't want to know who was out there, didn't want to see the face of whatever it was that had haunted me all these weeks. I heard footsteps approaching the front door, slow and deliberate, each step echoing through the quiet night. My phone buzzed again. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and saw the last notification from Tracker. You can't escape us. The doorbell rang, its sound slicing through the silence. I stood there, paralyzed, unable to move as the doorbell rang again, and again, each ring a reminder that there was no escape. And then, silence. I waited, heart pounding, expecting the door to crash open, expecting whatever was outside to burst into my house. But nothing happened. The figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me standing in the dark with only my phone for company. The screen flickered and the app reappeared. This time, a single line of text appeared on the screen. We are always watching. There's something about the snow that changes the world into something both beautiful and deeply unsettling. People say it brings a sense of peace, a quiet that falls over everything. But to me, there's a sinister calm that creeps into every corner of your mind when it snows too much, too fast, and too thick. The winter I'm talking about started with the first heavy snow of the season. A blizzard had hit our small town, dumping nearly 3 feet overnight, and in a town as isolated as ours, that meant total lockdown. No one came in, no one went out. It was peaceful at first. Snow piled up like a soft, white blanket over every house, car, and road. For a while, people in town joked about snow jail. But that was just the first day. When we woke up the next morning to see snow still falling just as heavily, the mood shifted. The weather station stopped broadcasting. The main power line was out and we were stuck on backup generators. Everyone thought it would end soon, but the snow just kept coming, each day darker than the last as the sky thickened, casting everything in shades of gray. A week went by then too. Some of us started to feel uneasy. There was no plow service. No emergency radio contact. It was like the whole world had stopped just for us. A few people tried to venture out, but none got far. The snow had piled so high around our houses that opening doors became impossible without a full-day digging session. Roads were buried, and even if we had tried, there was no way out. It was around the third week that things started to get strange. At first, it was just minor things you'd brush off as part of being cooped up too long. People reported hearing sounds in the snow, voices almost. Kids heard laughter echoing down from the trees at night, but when they'd peek out, there was nothing, just endless, unbroken white. That was also when we first heard about the disappearances. There were rumors of neighbors who had gone quiet, of houses where all the lights were off and footsteps had been spotted leading away from the door. The footprints would just stop halfway between the house and the tree line, no other tracks to explain where they'd gone. When I asked my neighbor, Mr. Hartman, he told me about the strange shadow he'd seen near the edge of his yard. He said it was tall, inhumanly tall, almost like a black pillar against the white. But it moved, he swore to me, something shifting in and out of view just beyond his porch. I could tell by his expression that he wasn't joking, and by the way he held his son close every night after that, I knew he wasn't seeing things. Then one night it came to my family's house. We had been hearing noises for days, odd sounds echoing through the snow, and my mother was convinced it was just the wind. I didn't believe her though. The noises were too deliberate, scratching, whispering, a low hum that sent shivers down my spine. I was up late that night, reading by flashlight in my room when I heard a gentle knock at the window. The sound was so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it, but there it was again. 3 soft, deliberate taps. I froze, staring at the frost-covered glass, feeling a surge of terror that rooted me in place. I should have ignored it. I should have stayed in bed, but my curiosity won. I reached over, brushing some frost from the glass to see outside. At first, I didn't see anything, just the thick snowflakes drifting down in silence. But then there it was, a dark figure just beyond the glass. It was almost human, but its skin was gray and hollow like a corpse pulled from the snow. Its eyes were dark, sunken, and in place of a mouth was a sharp, twisted smile. I yelped, pulling back from the window as its face pressed closer, leaving a dark, wet smudge against the glass. I stumbled backward, falling onto the bed, and watched as it slowly turned, leaving my window and vanishing into the snow. I could hear its footsteps crunching as it walked away, muffled by the thick snow. The next morning I told my parents what I'd seen, but they brushed it off as a bad dream. "You're cooped up too much, hun," my mom said, though I could tell she didn't believe it entirely. That day I checked the window, but all signs of the figure had vanished, only a faint stain where its face had pressed against the glass. Days turned into weeks, and the snowfall showed no signs of stopping. It was beginning to get too quiet in town, and the disappearances were adding up. Families stopped venturing out entirely, even into their own yards. One by one, houses became silent, the lights extinguished. Some were marked by those same tracks, leading from the door to nowhere. The storm was unrelenting, snow falling so thickly that it was starting to cover entire buildings. The snow was up to my bedroom window by then. My parents tried to keep us occupied, playing board games by flashlight, but there was an underlying fear none of us could ignore. I started staying up late, half hoping I'd see the figure again, half terrified that I would. And one night it came back. This time there was no tapping, no warning. I was lying in bed when I felt a chill sweep over the room. I glanced at the window and there it was, the figure standing just outside, staring at me. But this time it wasn't alone. There were others, faces pressed up against the glass, each one staring at me with that hollow expression, skin ashen and lips stretched into unsettling smiles. They pressed closer, covering my entire window, eyes like dark pits boring into me. I bolted for my parents' room, barely daring to glance back at my window. My dad grabbed a flashlight and went to check. I followed him, staying just behind as he opened my bedroom door, shining the light toward the window. The figures were gone. Snow fell as softly as it always had, and there was nothing but the faint frost on the glass. "It's just snow, honey," my mom said, trying to calm me down, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. That night I barely slept, convinced that they were still out there watching. The next morning my father decided he'd had enough. "We're getting out of here," he declared. He spent the day digging out a path to the car, though we had no idea if the roads were clear or if the car would even start. When night fell, we packed a few essentials, wrapped ourselves in every warm piece of clothing we had, and ventured out into the cold, silent night. The air was thick, heavy, as though the snow were watching us, aware of our every move. As we approached the car, I felt something strange, an itch in the back of my mind, a sense of being watched. I glanced around, trying to spot any movement in the shadows, but everything was still. Then I saw them. Figures stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. Their forms were indistinct, shadows against the snow, but their eyes glowed faintly, tracking our every step. We reached the car and got in, my dad fumbling with the keys as the engine struggled to start. My mom gripped my hand, her face pale as she stared out the window. I turned, catching sight of the figures slowly moving closer, their faces twisted into those same hollow smiles. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we sped down the snow-covered road, the figures fading into the distance. The snow was so thick that it was nearly impossible to see, the headlights barely penetrating the dark. My dad kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tightly as though afraid the car would slip out of his control. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the edge of town and the snow began to thin. The sky was clearer and the shadows of the figures faded from view. Relief washed over me as the trees thinned, replaced by familiar sights of neighboring towns, lights flickering in the distance. We never went back. I don't know if anyone else managed to escape, or if they're still there trapped in that unending winter. I've heard rumors from other nearby towns, stories of strange shadows in the snow, of people vanishing during blizzards. Every winter when the snow starts to fall, I think back to that town, buried somewhere beneath a thick blanket of white. I wonder if the figures still wander through the streets, searching for those who escaped, waiting for someone to return. Even now, I can't stand the sound of snow falling. It was amazing as always. Grandma's turkey was perfectly roasted, the stuffing was just right, and the mashed potatoes were creamy and rich. I think that's why it took us so long to notice something was off. We'd been eating for about an hour when my cousin Lucy asked for more rolls. I glanced at her plate, expecting to see crumbs and maybe a bit of mashed potatoes left. But her plate was full. And it wasn't just her. Everybody's plates were still heaping, the food untouched, yet everyone was eating as if it were their last meal. I leaned over to my sister, Emma, nudging her shoulder. "Hey, you good?" I whispered, glancing at her plate. It looked the same as before she'd started eating, yet she had a spoonful of potatoes poised at her lips. She nodded absent-mindedly, shoveling in another bite, and for a second, I caught that same distant strange look in her eyes that I'd seen in Grandma's earlier. As the hours stretched on, I began to feel sick. It wasn't that I'd eaten too much, it was the unnaturalness of it all. No matter how much we ate, the food on the table remained untouched, like an endless feast that refilled itself. I tried to tell my dad, but he just waved me off, looking annoyed. "Stop worrying, eat, it's Thanksgiving," he said, his voice muffled as he chewed. It was almost 9 o'clock when Grandma stood up, her chair scraping against the floor as she pushed it back. The clinking of forks against plates went silent as we all looked at her. She raised a glass, her voice strong but hollow as she spoke. "I'm so grateful for all of you being here tonight," she began, her eyes glassy and far off. "Family is everything. And tonight is special. Tonight we all stay together." Her words sent a shiver down my spine and I glanced around the table. My family looked different, almost like they were fading in and out of focus. Everyone was still eating, but their faces had grown pale, skin stretched tight across their faces, eyes sunken and blank. I was the only one who hadn't taken another bite, and I started to feel dizzy, like I was the only real person in a room full of ghosts. I decided to leave, get some fresh air, maybe even get back to town if I could find a ride. I tried standing up, but Grandma's voice cut through the air, sharp and final. "Sit down, dear," she said, her voice dripping with an authority that felt unnatural. My body locked up and I sat back down, feeling her eyes boring into me. "You're not finished yet?" Around the table, everyone kept eating, faces slack and vacant, like puppets being forced to perform. I couldn't look away from the sight of their hands moving mechanically, lifting forks, chewing, swallowing. And that food, it was like it was devouring them, not the other way around. Then Grandma turned and gestured toward the kitchen. "He's almost here." I didn't know who she was talking about, but just as she said it, a deep rumble of thunder echoed through the house and the lights flickered. When they came back on, someone else was standing in the doorway to the dining room. I didn't recognize him, but he was tall, dressed in an old, faded suit, with skin so pale it was almost translucent. He smiled, and there was something about his expression that made my stomach twist. "He's here to join us," Grandma said, her voice reverent. I looked around at my family. No one else reacted, they just kept eating, their faces blank and expressionless. The stranger walked over to the table, his steps slow and deliberate, and took the seat Grandma offered. He looked at me and I swear his eyes were like empty pits, drawing in the light around him. "You're lucky," he said softly, his voice a strange, distorted echo. "Your family has been chosen to feast with me." I glanced at the food on the table, at the endless piles that no one could finish, and I realized this was no ordinary Thanksgiving dinner. This was something ancient, something that had trapped us, ensnared us in a ritual we couldn't escape. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped by his gaze. Hours passed and the eating continued. I don't know how long it went on, but by the time the first hints of dawn began creeping through the windows, my family's faces looked more hollow, their bodies thinner, more frail. Grandma too was starting to fade, her skin taking on a sickly pallor, eyes blank as she ate over and over, like she was trying to fill some unending void. Finally, the stranger stood up, nodding approvingly as he surveyed the table. "You've done well," he said, his voice low and hollow. As he walked back toward the kitchen, he turned to me. "Remember this night. And next year you'll know what to do." And then he was gone. Just like that, he disappeared as if he'd never been there at all. The door to the kitchen swung shut behind him, and with it, the spell was broken. My family blinked, looked around, seeming to come back to themselves, but something was wrong. They were thin, skeletal, their eyes vacant, and their movements slow. They didn't remember anything from that night. They just looked at their empty plates, confused, like they'd just woken from a dream. We tried to go on with life, but things were never the same. My family began to waste away no matter how much they ate. My dad's jokes grew stale, my mom's laughter faded, and my sisters barely left their rooms. Thanksgiving came again this year, and they talked about going back to Grandma's, but none of us could face it. As for Grandma, we haven't seen her since. I had always loved the rain, the way it cleansed everything and left the world smelling fresh and earthy. Growing up in a rainy town, I spent my childhood puddle hopping in my bright yellow raincoat, a birthday gift from my mom when I was 6. But when I moved to college, I left it behind, thinking it was too childish for an adult. Years later, after my mom passed away, I found myself back at my childhood home, sorting through memories and belongings. In the back of my old closet, I found the yellow raincoat, still in pristine condition. For some reason I couldn't bring myself to throw it out, so I took it with me. In a weird way, it felt like holding onto a piece of my mom, a piece of those rainy, innocent days. It felt comforting to keep it around. But that comfort didn't last long. It started with small things. I'd hang the raincoat in the closet, but I'd find it draped over a chair or lying on the couch when I came home. I'd figured I'd forgotten where I put it. But after a while, it began to appear in stranger places, at the foot of my bed, over the back of my desk chair, sometimes even hanging on the bathroom door. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I found the raincoat sprawled out on my pillow, as if someone had carefully laid it there. I was starting to get unnerved, but I brushed it off as me just being scatterbrained from stress and grief. I folded the coat and put it back in the closet, closing the door a little harder than usual, as if that could keep it in place. But then the rain started. It was fall, and storms became more frequent, bringing dark clouds that rumbled ominously and rain that seemed to soak the world down to its bones. It was on one of those rainy nights that I first noticed something off. I was sitting in my living room, curled up with a book, listening to the sound of rain hammering against the windows. That's when I heard it, a faint rhythmic tap tap tap, as if someone was knocking, but not on my door. It was coming from somewhere inside the house. I froze, listening intently. The noise continued, and I realized it was coming from the hallway closet, the one where I kept my mom's old raincoat. Slowly I walked over, every instinct screaming for me to turn back. My fingers trembled as I opened the door. The raincoat hung there just as I'd left it, but there was a puddle on the floor beneath it, small but unmistakable. I knelt down to touch it, and the water was icy cold, as though it had come from outside. But there was no explanation for why it was there. The coat was dry to the touch. I shut the closet door, took a deep breath, and went back to the living room, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The next few nights, the knocking continued. I'd wake up to the same tap 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 coming from the closet, each time more insistent, like it was trying to get my attention. One night I got up, opened the closet door and stared at the raincoat. It looked harmless enough, the same bright yellow from my childhood memories, but something about it felt wrong. The next day I tried to get rid of it. I shoved it into a garbage bag and took it to a donation bin across town. But when I got home, it was hanging in the hallway closet again as if it had never left. I felt a chill go through me, and that night the knocking grew louder, the tapping more persistent. After a week of this, I was exhausted, desperate to rid myself of the raincoat. I decided to burn it. I took it to the backyard, dug a shallow pit and threw the coat in. I watched as the flames licked up its sleeves, turning the bright yellow fabric black as it smoldered. But just as I thought it was gone for good, a strange, damp smell filled the air, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The flames died down, and there, sitting in the ashes, was the raincoat. Untouched. I backed away, heart hammering, and ran inside. That night, I heard the knocking again, louder and more frantic. It felt like the walls themselves were shaking with it, like whatever was inside the raincoat was desperate to get out. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, listening as the tapping grew louder, now echoing throughout the house. It wasn't just the closet door this time. It was coming from the walls, the windows, even from under my bed. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the knocking drilled into my skull, relentless and unending. At dawn, the noise stopped and I collapsed in bed, drained. When I woke up, the house was eerily silent. I didn't dare look at the closet, didn't want to know if the raincoat was still there. But the rain was still falling outside, a heavy, endless downpour that seemed to darken the whole world. Then the phone rang. It was my neighbor, an old man who lived 2 houses down. He told me he'd seen something strange the night before, a figure standing outside my window watching. He said it looked like a child in a bright yellow raincoat. My blood ran cold as he described it. "Are you sure it was a child?" I asked, my voice shaking. Well, he hesitated. It was small, but its face, no, not a child. It looked older, wrong somehow. Hard to say in the rain. I thanked him and hung up, but I couldn't shake the dread that had settled over me. Whatever was attached to that raincoat wasn't a memory. It wasn't my mom or anything comforting. It was something else, something dark that had latched onto it and was now haunting me. I tried one last time to get rid of the raincoat. I took it out to the river, weighted down with rocks, and threw it in, watching it sink beneath the surface. I felt a strange sense of relief, thinking it was finally gone. But when I got home, it was waiting for me, hanging on the back of my bedroom door, dripping wet. I screamed, throwing it to the ground, and ran out of the house, not caring where I was going. I ended up at a friend's place, rambling about the raincoat and the noises. She let me stay the night, but even in her quiet apartment, I couldn't escape the tapping. It started again, faint and rhythmic, as though it were following me. The next morning, I knew I couldn't run from it anymore. I had to face whatever it was. I went home, and for the first time I put on the raincoat. It was damp and cold, and as I slipped it on, I felt an overwhelming sadness wash over me, a grief so intense it was suffocating. I could feel it in my bones, this aching sorrow, and an image flashed in my mind. A little girl standing in the rain, waiting for someone who would never come. Suddenly I understood. The raincoat wasn't haunted by my mom or some faceless spirit. It was haunted by a memory, a life cut short, a child who had been lost in the rain, waiting for a rescue that never came. And now it wanted to be found. I walked outside in the rain, letting it soak through the fabric as I wandered the neighborhood. I could feel the weight of the spirit in the coat, feel its sadness mingling with mine. But as the rain poured down, something changed. The sorrow lifted and the knocking stopped. For the first time in weeks there was silence. When I took off the raincoat and looked down, I saw a small handprint on the sleeve, faint but unmistakable. I felt a strange peace, like the spirit had finally moved on, freed from its endless waiting. I buried the raincoat in the backyard, hoping it would finally rest. And to this day, I haven't heard the tapping again. But every time it rains, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure in a yellow raincoat, standing just behind me, waiting for me to notice it again. My uncle always warned me about the fields outside his village in Angola. He said that they were ancient places where the old spirits still roamed. When I was a kid, I brushed it off as superstition, just stories told to keep children from wandering off. But in the summer of 2007, I returned to Angola for the first time in years and found out how wrong I'd been. I'd flown back to visit family, hoping to reconnect with my roots after living in the US for so long. My uncle, a quiet but kind man named Joaquim, picked me up from the airport and took me back to his small, isolated village. It was a world away from what I was used to, peaceful but eerie, surrounded by endless fields that seemed to stretch on forever. You stay inside after dark, Joaquim warned me on the first night. The fields, they have a way of making people lose their way. I nodded, still brushing it off. I was excited to be back, thrilled to explore, but my uncle's words clung to me like a dark shadow. The village was as small as I remembered, just a few families living there, each one bound by centuries-old traditions. During the day the children played outside, laughing and running through the fields. But as dusk approached, everything changed. Families would rush back indoors, securing their doors and windows, their faces shadowed with fear. One evening, while walking around the village, I noticed an old man sitting by the edge of a field, muttering to himself. His eyes were hollow and he was clutching a small pendant tightly. I recognized him as Senor Paulo, a farmer who'd lost his son Rui to the fields years ago. I didn't know the story well, but I'd heard rumors, something about a curse that had taken Rui. They said he'd disappeared after entering the fields at dusk and had never been seen again. The adults didn't talk about it much, but it was the kind of thing that lingered in the air, like a memory that everyone shared but wished they could forget. The next day I took a walk to explore those same fields. They looked ordinary enough, just tall, dry grasses swaying gently in the wind. But something about them felt off. There was a silence that seemed to deepen as I moved closer, a heavy stillness that swallowed up all sound. I couldn't even hear the birds or the faint hum of insects. Suddenly, I saw a glint of silver among the grasses. Curious, I pushed through and found an old pendant half buried in the dirt. It was tarnished and worn with a faint engraving on it. I wiped it off, trying to make out the details. It was strange, haunting, a face carved in a twisted expression, with hollow eyes that seemed to look right through me. It was eerie, but I thought it might belong to Senor Paulo, so I slipped it into my pocket, planning to give it to him later. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. The path I'd taken was gone. The field had closed in around me, grasses thick and unyielding in every direction. I told myself I was imagining things and picked a direction, pushing through, but no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find the edge. The grass grew denser, the silence heavier, pressing down on me until I felt like I could hardly breathe. Panic started to set in. I tried retracing my steps, but it was as if the landscape itself was shifting, twisting around me. My phone had no signal, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the field. In my desperation, I started running, thrashing through the grass, hoping I'd break free. But the more I ran, the deeper I seemed to go. Just when I thought I was hopelessly lost, I heard a faint voice calling my name. It was soft, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. Carlos. I froze, my heart pounding. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. It was my mother's voice. But that was impossible. My mother was back in Luanda, miles away. Still, the voice kept calling, growing louder, filled with a strange urgency. Carlos, come this way? I knew I shouldn't follow it, but something in the voice was compelling, drawing me forward. I stumbled through the grass, heart hammering as I searched for the source. The voice grew louder, echoing through the field until it was all I could hear. Finally, I broke through the grass and found myself in a small clearing, where a figure stood with their back to me, cloaked in shadows. They wore a tattered coat and a hat pulled low so I couldn't see their face. Mom? I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't her. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was not human. It was distorted, hollow-eyed, with a smile stretched far too wide across its face. The pendant in my pocket grew cold, as if reacting to the thing in front of me. I took a step back, heart pounding, but the figure held up a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin. Give it to me, it hissed, its voice like the rustling of the dry grass. "Give back what you took." I fumbled in my pocket, pulling out the pendant. I held it out to the figure, my hands shaking. As soon as it touched the pendant, its face twisted into a look of rage, and it let out a shriek that seemed to tear through the very air around me. "Return what was taken," it screamed, its voice echoing in my mind, filling my head with a blinding pain. I dropped the pendant and stumbled back, clutching my head as the world around me spun. When I came to, I was lying at the edge of the field, with my uncle standing over me, his face filled with relief and fear. "You went into the fields, didn't you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Did you see it?" I nodded, still shaking as I tried to process what had happened. What was that thing?" My uncle's face grew grim. "The fields are cursed, Carlos. They've been cursed for centuries. Long ago, people practiced dark rituals here, offering sacrifices to the spirits of the land. The spirits grew angry, twisted by the sacrifices, and they linger. They draw people in, trap them. I didn't sleep that night, and I kept the door to my room locked, the pendant burning like an icy brand in my pocket. The next day I returned it to Señor Paulo, who took it without a word, his face pale and grim. He looked at me with a sadness that was almost pity, as if he knew that once you'd seen the spirits in the fields, they never truly left you. The rest of my trip passed in a blur, and I left Angola as soon as I could. But even back home, far from those cursed fields, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, following me. Every time I close my eyes, I see that twisted face, those hollow eyes staring into my soul, waiting for the moment when I'll be alone, when they can finally take what I owe them. And every time it rains, I hear my mother's voice again, calling me from somewhere far away, pleading, begging me to come back to the fields and finish what I started. I'd always dreamed of visiting Antigua and Barbuda, turquoise waters, white sandy beaches, and a history steeped in pirate lore. I finally got my chance last year, tagging along with my friend Sarah, a photographer, on a trip to capture the untamed beauty of the islands. I thought I'd be seeing the typical island scenes, but what we found instead left us both scarred in ways we could never fully explain. Our base was a small cottage Sarah rented from a local family in a secluded spot on the north side of Antigua. It was nestled by the coast, a perfect spot for sunrise photography. The family was friendly but strangely evasive when it came to certain parts of the island. They'd cautioned us, for instance, against venturing out near the old ruins in the hills. "Those ruins have been there for hundreds of years," Sarah's contact, a local named Emery, warned. "The old sugar plantations. They have spirits that don't rest well." Sarah laughed it off, but Emery's warning echoed in my head. He had that serious, knowing look, as if he'd seen things and didn't need to prove it to anyone. The first few days went by as planned. We toured the island, capturing sunrises and sunsets, crystal clear waters, and glimpses of island life. But there was an oddness too, a feeling that settled in as soon as the sun began to set each day. The air turned cooler, carrying a strange, earthy scent that I couldn't quite place. And I felt like we were being watched, although I chalked it up to paranoia. One evening, after a particularly long day of shooting, Sarah suggested we hike up to the ruins. "Just a couple of photos, Mike," she insisted. "Imagine the shots we'll get. Nobody shoots there because of the local superstitions. It'll be our little secret." Reluctantly, I agreed, and we set off just before dusk. The trail twisted through dense forest, and soon we were deep in a jungle that seemed to swallow all sound. The shadows lengthened, twisting in ways that didn't seem natural, and as we neared the ruins, a chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. Finally, we arrived at the crumbling remains of what must have been a grand estate once. Vines choked the walls, and the stone was blackened in places as if by fire. Sarah was thrilled. She started snapping photos immediately, capturing the decayed grandeur of the place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As she continued shooting, I wandered into what looked like the main building. Inside, the air was thick, damp, almost suffocating. The floor was littered with fragments of broken pottery and old glass bottles, relics of a time long past. Strange markings adorned the walls, faded symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own in the dim light. "Sarah," I called, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think we should go." But Sarah didn't answer. Instead, the silence seemed to press down on me, thick and oppressive. I looked around, but she was nowhere in sight. "Sarah?" I called again, louder this time, my voice echoing off the stone walls. Still nothing. Panicking, I hurried back outside, only to find her standing in front of what looked like a broken-down well, her back turned to me. She was staring down into it, utterly still. "Sarah?" I shouted, running up to her. She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge me. I put a hand on her shoulder, and she finally turned, her face pale and her eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen before. "There's something down there," she whispered. I glanced into the well, but it was pitch black. A rancid smell wafted up from its depths, thick and nauseating. I pulled her back, but she resisted, staring back down into the darkness with a strange fascination. "We need to leave, Sarah. Now," I insisted, my voice barely concealing the terror rising in my chest. Reluctantly, she nodded, and we started back down the trail. But the path seemed different somehow, twisted and unfamiliar, as if the forest had shifted while we were inside the ruins. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. The jungle felt alive, breathing around us, closing in. We finally stumbled out of the forest just as night fell. Back at the cottage, Sarah barely spoke, her face pale and drawn. She locked herself in her room, refusing to come out. That night, I barely slept, haunted by dreams of dark wells and twisted shadows. I could still smell that awful stench from the well, as if it had soaked into my skin. The next morning, I woke to find Sarah gone. Her camera and gear were still there, but she was nowhere to be found. Panicked, I searched the cottage and the surrounding area, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. I found nothing but silence. Desperate, I went to Emery, explaining what had happened. His face grew grave as he listened, and when I finished, he shook his head. "Those ruins? They're cursed. The spirits there, they don't let go of those who come too close." He joined me in the search, combing through the jungle, retracing our steps. As night fell, we arrived back at the ruins. The well loomed in the darkness, and I felt a wave of nausea just looking at it. Emery approached cautiously, muttering something in Creole under his breath, a prayer or a protection spell, perhaps. "Look," he said, pointing to the edge of the well. I peered closer, and my heart nearly stopped. A single muddy handprint marked the stone, fresh as if someone had just touched it. Emery and I searched for days, but we never found Sarah. Eventually, I returned home, carrying her camera and the weight of her disappearance with me. Months passed, but the memories of that night lingered, haunting me in ways I couldn't explain. I couldn't bring myself to look through Sarah's photos, the pain of her loss too raw, too fresh. But one night, unable to sleep, I finally did. At first, the photos were what I expected: landscapes, beaches, local wildlife. But as I scrolled, the images grew darker, more distorted. Shots of the jungle twisted at odd angles, shadows stretching across the frame in unnatural ways. Then, finally, the photos of the ruins. There was one of the well shot from above. But as I looked closer, I noticed something in the shadows. Something pale, almost translucent, peeking out from the darkness. A face. My blood ran cold as I clicked to the next photo. It was closer this time, the face more defined, features twisted in a grotesque grin. And then the last photo, so close that it filled the entire frame, its hollow eyes staring directly at the camera, directly at me. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding. But even with the screen off, I could still see that face burned into my mind, haunting me in the dark. Since that night, I haven't been the same. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing in the shadows, her face hidden. I'll hear her voice, soft and faint, calling my name from somewhere far away. I never returned to Antigua. I couldn't. But every now and then I'll dream of the well, of the twisted path through the jungle, and that face staring up at me from the darkness, waiting. I never used to believe in bad luck, especially the whole superstition around the number 13. Black cats crossing paths, broken mirrors, all those things, silly superstitions, I thought. But everything changed on my 13th birthday, a day that I'd never forget. It was early October, crisp leaves falling outside my window, and the air was thick with autumn. It should have been a normal day, but it wasn't. I awoke feeling like something was watching me, waiting just beyond my line of sight. But every time I turned, there was nothing there. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just nerves. After all, a 13th birthday is a big milestone. That night, my family had planned a small celebration. Just my parents and a few close friends. The air seemed thick with unease as they gathered around the table, but they laughed it off as just a spooky Halloween season vibe. But as the candles on my cake were lit, the lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. Then, just as I leaned forward to blow them out, every candle went out at once, extinguished by some unseen breeze. We all looked around, startled, but laughed it off as a coincidence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of something lurking around me, something dark. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. At first, it was small things. A chill in the room, a feeling of being watched, objects in my room slightly moved. And then there were the dreams. Every night, I dreamed of the same thing. A dark, endless hallway with 13 doors, all closed. I knew I shouldn't open them, yet I felt this overwhelming urge to reach the last door. On the 4th night, I did it. I reached the 13th door. It was old, rotting, and as I opened it, the darkness inside felt like it would swallow me whole. I awoke, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But as the days went on, it was like the dream had followed me into my waking life. The following week, I was walking home from school when I saw it, 13 written in chalk on the sidewalk. The number had been hastily scrawled, almost like someone had been running as they wrote it. A chill ran down my spine and I hurried past, pretending I hadn't seen it. When I got home, the number was there again, this time on my bedroom wall. Just a simple, smeared 13. I asked my parents about it, but they just brushed it off as a prank. I tried to believe them, but the fear gnawed at me. What kind of prank was this? How had they even gotten into my room? The next morning, I found myself counting things compulsively. When I poured cereal into a bowl, there were exactly 13 pieces. When I looked at the clock, it was always 13 minutes past the hour. Even the trees outside my window seemed to be lined up in sets of 13. It was everywhere, an inescapable presence. As Halloween approached, things only got worse. My dreams returned, more vivid and sinister. In them, I was always in that same endless hallway, always reaching for that 13th door. But now I wasn't alone. I could hear whispers, faint voices calling my name. They echoed down the hallway, chilling me to my bones. One night, I dared to ask who was there. "Who are you?" I called into the darkness, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. Then one voice, clear and sharp, answered. "We are the 13. We've been waiting for you." I jolted awake, but the fear didn't fade with the dream. The voice had sounded real, like it was right there in my room. I tried to tell my parents, but they dismissed it as a nightmare. They couldn't understand, no one could. On Halloween night, I stayed up late, too scared to sleep. Midnight came and went, and then just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a knock on my door. I froze, staring at the door, but there was nothing. Then I heard it again, louder this time. I forced myself to get up and open it, expecting to see my parents. But no one was there. Only the hall, stretching out into darkness. I closed the door, heart racing, when I heard it, a slow, deliberate tapping. I turned to the window, and there, written in the condensation on the glass, was the number 13. This time I didn't brush it off. I knew something was coming for me. For weeks I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away. But the number kept appearing, following me wherever I went. I saw it in my school locker, scratched into my desk, even in my food. It was relentless. Finally, I decided to go back to that place in my dreams. I let myself fall into sleep, walking the endless hallway once more. This time, the doors were open, each one leading into darkness. I reached the 13th door, my heart pounding, and as I opened it, I felt a presence like 1,000 eyes watching me. Inside the room, there was only a mirror. I stared into it, and my reflection stared back, but something was wrong. It smirked, even though I wasn't smiling. Then, without warning, my reflection reached out, its hand stretching through the glass. I screamed, but there was no sound. The last thing I saw before waking was my reflection, dragging me into the darkness. Since that night, things have never been the same. I still see the number 13 everywhere, and now I know what it means. It's a reminder, a warning. And every time I look in the mirror, I see something staring back at me, something that isn't quite me. So, if you ever find yourself counting things in sets of 13, or if you see that number written where it shouldn't be careful. Because the 13 are always watching, waiting for someone to open that final door. And once you do, they'll never let you go. I never thought much about the things left behind when people move out. Old furniture, boxes of forgotten belongings, they were just pieces of someone else's life. As a property cleaner, I'd seen it all, but nothing prepared me for the day I found the broom. It was early October, and the air was filled with the damp scent of fallen leaves. My company had been hired to clean an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. It was a chilly, gray morning when I arrived, and the house sat there, looking oddly crooked against the overcast sky. As I walked inside, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and a faint smell of mildew filled the air. The house had clearly been vacant for a while, abandoned by its last owner. My job was to clear it out, but as I walked room to room, I noticed something strange. No furniture, no boxes, just an eerie emptiness. Then, in a dusty corner of the living room, I saw it, an old wooden broom leaning against the wall. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about it. It was an old broom, the kind with a wooden handle and stiff, dried bristles. But as I got closer, I noticed strange symbols carved into the handle, rough etchings that spiraled down the wood in jagged lines. I traced my fingers over them, feeling an odd chill run up my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the broom was watching me. Ignoring the broom, I continued with the cleanup, moving through the empty rooms and scrubbing away years of grime. But no matter where I went, I always found the broom. I'd leave it in one room, turn around, and there it would be, leaning against the wall as if it had followed me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I'd simply overlooked it. But each time it appeared closer, leaning slightly forward like it was looking right at me. After a while, I couldn't ignore the prickling feeling at the back of my neck. The house was cold, but that broom gave off an unnatural chill. I tried not to think about it too much, but the more I avoided it, the more it seemed to appear. By mid-afternoon, I was getting nervous. I'd gone to the basement to clear out some old cobwebs when I heard a scraping sound. I turned, and there it was, resting against the doorway. Heart pounding, I stepped toward it. "Who's doing this?" I shouted, hoping maybe a coworker was playing a prank. Silence. The broom remained where it was, unmoving. But as I stared, I felt a strange pull, as if it were calling me, urging me to come closer. The air felt thick, almost as if it were holding its breath. I took a step forward, unable to resist, my hand reaching for the handle. The moment my fingers touched it, the air around me shifted. I heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. I yanked my hand away, my heart pounding in my chest. I could have sworn I felt something pulse beneath my fingers, a heartbeat buried within the wood. Shaking, I forced myself to move, trying to ignore the feeling of unseen eyes following me through every room. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the broom. I'd left it in the house, sure, but in my mind, I could still feel its presence. And then, just as I was drifting off to sleep, my phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen and my blood ran cold. It was a photo of the broom standing in my bedroom doorway. I jumped out of bed, scanning my room, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. I checked my phone again, but the photo was gone. My hands were shaking as I lay back down, my heart racing. I barely slept, every creak and groan of my apartment sending chills down my spine. The next day, I decided to return to the farmhouse. I told myself I'd imagined it all, but something in me needed to go back, to prove it was just an old broom. As I entered the house, the atmosphere felt different, heavier somehow, like the house was holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of smoke, and I noticed strange symbols on the walls that I hadn't seen before, the same symbols carved into the broom's handle. I found it in the living room, standing upright in the center of the room, waiting for me. My heart pounded as I approached it, my footsteps echoing in the empty house. I reached out and this time I picked it up. The moment I touched it, a jolt of cold surged up my arm, freezing my veins. The room spun and I felt myself being pulled, like the broom was dragging me into another world. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision, twisting and contorting. I could feel something dark, something ancient, whispering in the back of my mind. Images flashed before me, figures in hooded robes, chanting in a language I didn't understand. They held brooms like mine, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I felt a sharp pain in my chest and suddenly I was back in the living room, gasping for breath. The broom was still in my hand, but now I knew what it was. It wasn't just a tool. It was a vessel, a conduit for something dark and twisted. And now it was awake. I dropped it, stumbling back, but as I turned to leave, I felt an invisible force pulling me back. The broom lay on the floor, but its bristles seemed to twitch, reaching out toward me like skeletal fingers. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my eyes on it, but the moment I looked away, I heard footsteps. Soft, shuffling footsteps coming from somewhere deeper in the house. I bolted for the door, but it wouldn't open. The house groaned around me and I felt the air grow colder. I turned and there it was, standing upright once more, blocking my path. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel them in my mind, probing, searching. I don't remember how I got out, but when I stumbled into the sunlight, the house was silent once more. I ran to my car, refusing to look back. I could still feel it, the weight of those unseen eyes watching me as I sped away. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen. I'd find brooms outside my apartment, leaning against my door, appearing in places they shouldn't be. Every night, I heard whispers, faint and sinister, calling me back to the farmhouse. And then the dream started. I was back in the house, walking through the dark hallways, with the broom always at my side. I could feel it watching me, its presence suffocating, as if it were binding itself to me, claiming me. In every dream I tried to escape, but it would always pull me back, dragging me deeper into the darkness. One night, I woke up to find it in my room, standing at the foot of my bed, its bristles reaching out like skeletal fingers. I screamed, but no sound came out. I could only watch as it crept closer, inch by inch, until it was hovering above me. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts, filling my mind with images of fire and darkness, of hooded figures and ancient rites. I felt its presence wrap around me, cold and unforgiving, and I knew in that moment that I was no longer alone. They say you can't escape a curse, that it binds itself to you until it consumes you. I don't know how much time I have left. Every night, the broom comes closer, whispering, watching, waiting. And every morning, I find another broom outside my door, a silent reminder that it's coming for me. So if you ever find an old, abandoned broom, don't touch it. Leave it where it lies and walk away. Because once you pick it up, it won't let you go.